It's an absolute pleasure to have an author here with us, a superstar author. Lauren Markham is not only a journalist, but has written 2 published books so far. Her first one, called The Far Away Brothers, 2 Young Migrants and the Making of an American Life. That was published in 2017 and won multiple awards, including, I believe, the New York Times awards and the LA Times. So a real intricate, in-depth look at 2 brothers who are making their way to the U.S. Also, currently, 2024, her book, A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belonging, is on the list of top books in 2024 also to read. So I hope you put these on your Amazon wish list or your local bookseller. And not to think that she's been slouching. She has a book coming out in 2025 also called Immemorial. A real pleasure. Lauren is also an educator and is here visiting us from the Oakland International High School. She's going to talk to us about school as community and community as school. So thank you for joining us.
Hello. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm so honored to be here, to follow all of these incredible speakers and to be with all of you doing this really transformative work. So welcome. We've been welcomed by our illustrious leaders, by our hosts, by leaders in the state, by song, by poetry, by statistics, and by, I think, this spirit of collective purpose that permeates the room as we kind of engage in this convening of collective work. And there's something really fitting about this amazing sort of cascade of welcomes that we've gotten today, because on a fundamental level, I think the work that we are all engaged in is work of welcome. And one of the things I want to talk about today is like the various contours and textures of that welcome and how that can manifest in so many ways and the impact of that. So, but first, I wear many hats, but in my deepest soul, I'm an educator, meaning I'm going to make y'all do an activity. We're going to do an activity together. So we're going to actually start with a welcome circle, and this is something designed by Oakland International High School students. Our student leaders designed this to create a formal threshold of caring welcome for students newly arrived in our school. So this is something that our students lead with newly arrived students like throughout the year as they come to our school. So we're so happy you're here. Welcome. Okay, so you're already in circles, which is so wonderful. So in your table groups, I would like you to go around the table and share your name, your grade, you could share your role. I've adapted some of these for our purposes, and how you're doing today. And I invite you to use one of these. Are you feeling sunny? Are you feeling like, a little rain cloud? Are you feeling a little tornado? Like, how are you feeling today? And we're just gonna do lightning round around the table. So take a second to start. Okay, everybody. I'm actually previewing this. We're not going to do this game, but I invite you. I'm going to seed this game. Our welcome circle normally does this game. So we would have our student leaders who are acting as circle keepers, welcoming our newly arrived students onto campus, sitting in circle, starting with this, how are you feeling today? And then we'll do a game, which is 2 truths and a lie. We're not gonna do that today for time purposes, but really encourage you to maybe try this over lunch or something. So the game, if you're not familiar, is you say 3 things about yourselves, 2 things are true, 1 thing is a lie, and then the other people guess. So just stick that in the back of your head. But the next round we're going to do is sharing in your group what is something about your learning community. All of us here are in some way a part of a learning community that makes you proud. And I'm going to invite you to do this in a single sentence, okay? What is something about your learning community that makes you proud? Take it away, circle. All right. The next round, and I encourage you to start in a different place. One thing I didn't have you all do is pick a talking piece from the middle of your table, which could be like a coffee cup or a water bottle, or if you want to do that in the next round, the talking piece is something that follows, whoever's talking holds the talking piece and passes it on. So round 2 is, what is or was hard about being a new student in a new country? Or, if you yourself were not a new student in a new country, what do you see your students, the folks you work with, struggling most as new students in a new country? And again, keep it to like a sentence. I know it's hard. Okay. This is actually a round that you're going to do silently and to yourself, which is ask yourself, what is an important goal for you that you have for your work in your learning community? The student version of this question is, what is a goal you have for your time at this school or this school year? That's what we ask new students. So ask yourself, what is an important goal you have for your work in your learning community? What is a goal that you hold in that work? I'll give you a minute to think about that. We're going to hold that goal today throughout this talk and throughout this day, I hope. And my hope is that the insight and wisdom we get from the talks we've already heard and from all the amazing sessions into the afternoon dovetails with that, is in conversation with this goal that we hold. Okay. So back to the spirit of welcome. I should say that, like, at my own wedding, my husband and I made everyone do group activities. I can't help it. So thank you. What I didn't anticipate, it was so beautiful and joyful to hear everyone, like the chirps of everyone speaking, and I didn't anticipate how left out I was going to feel here. Okay. So today I wanted to share a little bit about what brings me to this room and to this work, and why I keep doing it. I've spent about 20 years working at the intersection of immigration and education. I've worked at resettlement agencies, at school districts, at nonprofits, at immigration legal organizations, and for the majority of that 20 years, I've worked in some capacity as an administrator at Oakland International High School, which is a public school in Oakland that serves 100% recently arrived immigrant youth. And I always think of this, and this is connected to what we heard earlier, some of the statistics we saw and the sort of projecting into the future. We don't know who's coming in the future, right? I always think of our school, and I think this is true of all of our work, as delayed mirror of world events, right? We watch injustices or persecution or violence or war, environmental catastrophe, all other things like this, and causes roil all around the globe. And eventually people, the lucky ones, make their way to safety. And I think often it is the luckiest ones, and not to be a Pollyanna or make light of the struggles, but it's often the luckiest ones who make their way to our communities and our programs and our schools. My work has always focused on programs around and outside the classroom that support students and family members to root, to find welcome and purpose and resources, and to secure belonging. And I think of my work and all of the work that we do in this room as really being an agent of belonging. That's what I think of my purpose, like on a foundational level. That can take many forms, that can look many ways, but being an agent of belonging. I'm also a journalist and a writer covering issues of global injustice, and most often through the lens of migration, because I understand migration to be one of the most urgent and compelling prisms to understand global inequality and what it means to be alive on Earth today. For a long time, I saw my work as a journalist and my work in schools and at the intersection of immigration and education as really distinct. Like, I had these two worlds. While it looks different in practice, and these two fields are kind of operating in different scope, my education work is really local. It's down here. It's working with individual students and in community, right? Directly with people, often over long periods of time. Whereas, like, my journalism work is much more up here. I often experience it as like, it often takes me to other places and kind of like hovering above the map to understand root causes and systems. But I see now, after many years, that at its at its core, this work, its source and its impulse is really one and the same. It's the same work from different angles, whether I'm figuring out how to improve equitable outcomes amongst students at a school or secure bilingual mental health services for a newly arrived group of students, or whether I'm writing about US immigration system's vast surveillance system or medical abuse in US detention. No matter what I'm doing, what I'm fundamentally doing, right, what it looks like I'm doing in action, what I'm fundamentally doing is working to understand the mechanisms and levers of exclusion, be that borders, detention systems, xenophobic policies, exclusionary policies in our school districts, a rhetoric of racialized nationalism, and I'm also trying to understand the levers of belonging. Exclusion and belonging, these are really, really key elements to my work, and I think all of our work. And I'm wondering, how do these function and play out over our lives as individuals, over the lives of the communities we work with, we live in, we serve, we're connected to, and how do they work like in the larger body politic? How do they function and play out over our lives? These are questions that are important to ask both on the level of national or regional policy and on the individual level, right? How, for instance, do we welcome a new student into our school mid-year, a student who has fled persecution and danger, often as a result of the long reach of the mechanisms of exclusion, right? So this welcome circle, this is connected to big questions and big structures of exclusion and belonging, and we have a hand to play in that. Another way of thinking about all of this is that I've spent my career writing and thinking about borders. Borders, as we know, are super tricky things because they are both severe, rigid, of great and grave consequence, because they determine who is in or out, sometimes even who lives and dies. But the other thing about borders is that they're a total fiction, right? They are as made up as the lines my daughter draws on her paper with magic marker. We've invented them. Humans have invented borders from whole cloth, and it's us who have given them great power. And this, to me, as I understand it, I see borders as a deep, deep force of inequality, of rupture, of hierarchy, and of exclusion. I'm also not just talking about borders on the map. I'm talking about, the idea of borders, kind of like the internal border, the idea of border as something that divides like us and them, right? It's what forces, borders are what force people from Afghanistan to Ukraine to El Salvador to Gaza from home, to Burma from home, right? Borders aren't just like a topographical line or a geographical line. It's a psychic line as well. Divisive rhetoric has been a mainstay of politics throughout time, but today that rhetoric relies on the concept of the border. Divisive rhetoric, us versus them, it's very much these days, and not just in the United States, right, steeped in border logic, right? That border logic is a justification and it's a motivating factor for this horrific divisive rhetoric. And again, this is true in the US, this is true in France, this is true in Hungary, this is true in Greece, this is true in Thailand, right? In Turkey, all over the world. This logic is that there are marauding invaders at the gates, wherever the gates are, and the rhetoric promises that it's only by doubling down on this border logic that one can be protected and saved. I really, really love this line, so I don't love that, but I do really love this line from Wendy Brown, the scholar Wendy Brown, who works among other places at Berkeley. This question, when do the comforting walls of a house become the confining walls of a prison? When does the fortress become a penitentiary? This is from her book, Walled States and Waning Sovereignty, and it's all about the rise of border walls around the kind of rash of building border walls around the world. Another way one way I like to think about this quote and why it's been really motivating and animating to me is that it's this question, like, borders are not just geopolitical lines, right? They're psychic ones. And I actually think they're even more powerful as psychic lines than they are as actually, attempted dividing lines. Because as we know, throughout time, right, people can go above walls, under walls, beneath walls, through walls, around walls, right? So here's the question, back to us. How in this room do we thwart this border logic? How do we thwart it not just as a political line, but as a psychic one? How do we become and persist in more deeply becoming agents of belonging? So this is where I'm super biased, but I believe this, so I'm just gonna go with it. This has been my life's work, right? Schools and places of learning centers are absolutely critical to thwarting the psychic lines of division. This is, in part, a practical matter. Schools are filled with students, and thus they are necessarily places of encounter and of connection. But I think, and I think we all know, schools, learning centers, in their best nature, are communities above all else, right? It's not just about, are we learning math? What are our metrics in English? What are our test scores? You know, we've heard some of this already. Like, most deeply, schools are places where we build connection, a sense of possibility, a sense of belonging with and to one another. We in this room know this to be true, that no real or meaningful learning can happen if students do not feel safe, if they do not feel connected to one another and caring adults who they feel really believe in them, if they are not resourced, right, around the classroom and in their worlds and in their lives and their communities, if they are not given opportunities that light them up and make them feel successful and excited for the world around them and their worlds to come. Without a sense of trust, without a sense of belief in one another and a sense of purpose, that idea of like wanting to get up and go somewhere and see people and create something together, right? Whether it's a group project or an after-school celebration or a friendship or like, you know, a community movement. People don't want to go to school if we don't have those things. And honestly, we all get that, right? Like, I don't want to go to work if I don't have those things, right? Like this feeling of shared purpose and connection and like we are making something together. That's what a school should feel like. And I'm using school interchangeably with like centers of learning because I think we all work, some of us in schools and some in more like non-formal education. It's all one and the same, right? In terms of this purpose. Oh no, I lost my place because okay. So that is, all of this is a sense of belonging, and it's the opposite of a dividing line, right? A center of learning is, in its best incarnation, a place with an open door that says, come in, we see you, here, there is something for everyone, and we're gonna help you find that. So I don't know if you're aware, but there's an election coming up pretty soon in this country, and so we are extra steeped in hateful rhetoric about people coming from elsewhere and what that is doing or might do to our country. And this is all hateful, fictional talk, right? But it's very powerful. And it's easy to feel, I don't know if you all feel this, but it's easy to feel at times that there's very little that we can do. We can feel totally hamstrung and just kind of like immobilized by this rhetoric. What can we do as individuals to impact the violence that we see in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, the border violence we see around the world, the border violence that we see in places like Greece, where I've done a lot of reporting on our own borders, in Russia and Hungary, in the UK, right? How we long so much to be able to push some button and reverse centuries of hateful rhetoric and immigration policies that barricade, right? And colonialist policies of global inequality, right? All of these things that have curdled into this global regime of hate that ruins lives and kills. Facing such personal inefficacy, we have to remember that the border, again, isn't just a political line, it's a psychic one. And those of us who've been subjected to border logic and border violence know this more than anyone. This psychic line can follow us across time and across space, like long after we've crossed the so-called border, right? And long after, we've like much further into the interior and through time, this border logic leaves a residue. So I guess I want to offer that there is, in fact, and this is something I come to myself again and again, there is, in fact, something we can do to upend the systemic division so baked into our country and in destination countries like ours around the world. This is work that we are already doing here, supporting young people to find their place after upheaval and severance from their homes. It's for this reason that I've always found great meaning and power in doing this very local, very intentional work with people who have been subjected to the indignities and injustices of the global border regime, this, effectively a global apartheid. Because while we watch horrors unfold around the world and feel at times brought to our knees with the horror of our own inefficacy, there is something to be done right here and right now. We can welcome our young people, welcome their families, and support them to find meaning and belonging in their new lives. Meaning and belonging being the preconditions of home. But now I'm going to go a little bit deeper, ask us to, because one thing that is also true is that those of us doing this really meaningful work, even while we may understand the insidiousness of that psychic borderline, it doesn't mean that we are not also infected by it. This is something that I learned firsthand when writing and touring with my first book, The Faraway Brothers, and then again when I was writing The Map of Future Ruins. And so I want to tell a couple of stories of the ways that even as I am like writing about and doing this community work around the violence of borders, I too have recognized these moments of like, oh my gosh, like this logic is within me too, and I have to sort of exercise it to be better at the work that I'm doing and to do more just work. So a couple of stories. So one is this. I was reporting from a courtroom in downtown San Francisco that's like a dedicated youth docket. So it's all minors, right? All minors coming to this court. And as many of us know, unlike in criminal court, people in immigration proceedings are not provided attorneys for free, even though you're about 10 times more likely to win your immigration case if you have an immigration attorney, right? So it's this massive system of injustice. It's difficult to find free attorneys and difficult to find any attorneys at all, and they're often expensive if you can find them. So there I was in downtown San Francisco in this juvenile docket, and there was a little 4-year-old girl. Her name was called, and she was asked to come up, right? So imagine I'm the judge. There's one of those little like fences there with one of those kind of like swinging saloon doors. This little 4-year-old comes up by herself through the doors and sits at a table, big wooden table here by herself, and right here is a table full of government attorneys whose job is effectively to try to deport her and all the other kids sitting in the back, right? She's there alone. She stood up, she comes, she sits there, and she's like so brave looking up at the judge. And the judge says, "Do you have an attorney?" It gets interpreted, and she says, "No." And he said, "Do you have an adult with you?" And this again was translated, and the little girl said yes, and pointed back to someone who turned out to be her stepmom. Then the judge took a deep breath and said, "Well, I want to invite this woman to come up and sit next to you, because in my courtroom, I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable, and I want you to have your grown-up with you so you can come and sit down." I'm getting shivers now thinking about it, but this is interesting, right? I was in there, the whole courtroom sort of took this breath of like, because it was so horrible to see this little girl by herself in such a high-stakes situation. And then there was this act of mercy, it felt like, that this judge was giving, this act of mercy. He didn't have to do that, right? And he said, "Come on up." But then I realized this is where the border logic had sort of gotten stuck in me, right? On the one hand, yes, he didn't have to do that, and that was an act of mercy. But I had switched to focusing on the beauty of the mercy that this man was giving, as opposed to just like, he did a decent thing, and yay, that's good, he did a decent thing. But let's have that be the default, right? Let's have that doing the decent thing as being the default, as opposed to this sort of like, exalted behavior. So I was in awe of this man and of his generosity, but when I caught myself, thinking this way, I realized that I had been infected by the system just a few hours in that courtroom, that I could no longer see straight in a way of like what was righteous and what was good. The logic had shifted me, right? The baseline logic of that place had shifted me. A similar thing happened when I was reporting in Greece a few years ago for my most recent book, which is called A Map of Future Ruins. I had spent years studying the immigration detention here in the United States, and I'd written an op-ed for the New York Times, which was called "The Unnecessary Cruelty of the U.S. Immigration System," right? It was very steeped in the system's cruelty. I was reporting in Greece a couple years later on a group of young Afghans who had been arrested in spite of zero evidence against them of having burned down the largest refugee camp in Europe, and then they were tried in a kangaroo court. So I was visiting camps all over Greece, which are notoriously awful places, and some advocates were showing me around a new camp on the island of Samos, which is called a controlled access center. So in Greece, they were starting to build detention facilities, more closed spaces that resembled those in the United States. And an advocate said to me, "Do you see how awful these places are? People can only leave once or twice a week. They want to go buy groceries, they want to go into town or meet with a lawyer. They can only leave once or twice a week. They used to be able to leave, whenever they wanted." And it was terrible, the conditions that these people were living in, and they were treated like criminals, like they are here, right, for just the very fact of being refugees. That's what my whole book was about this, right? But even still, I caught myself thinking, well, gosh, these places aren't that bad, right? Because in the United States, you can't leave at all. It's not like a prison, it's an actual prison, right? And it's not that that is incorrect, like that's true about the United States, the comparison was true, but see how the normalcy of one completely wicked system can move the needle of baseline thinking toward that of injustice, how injustice becomes normalized. It can really be hard to see straight when this rhetoric and this logic is just everywhere. Okay, one more anecdote, and then I'm almost done. When I was traveling the country talking to audiences about the Faraway Brothers, which is about two identical twin 17-year-olds who came here as unaccompanied minors from El Salvador in 2017, almost inevitably on every stop, whether it was in Oakland or Los Angeles or Auburn or Iowa City or New York City or Boston or Vermont, all over the country, I got the same question from an audience member. It was truly astonishing. It was like an anthropological study. It was almost always from a woman who was old enough to have 17-year-old kids, have raised 17-year-old kids, and the woman was almost always, not always, but almost always white. And the question was always something like this: I loved your book, but I was really, really frustrated because I was rooting for the kids in your book, but I was also, and I cared for them so much, but I was so mad at them for all the mistakes that they made. So a couple of things are interesting here. One, this is not a question, right? This is a statement. It's a comment. But on a deeper level, I think there was a question there. The unspoken question was like, why? Why was it, how? How is it possible for me to care about these young people and be so frustrated at them? So the easy answer is like, hi, teenagers, right? Like, hi, young people, hi, humans, right? That we contain multitudes. But I think there's actually something even more pernicious and interesting there, right? These were all readers who willingly picked up a book about immigration that was very sympathetic to people on the move and very critical of the US immigration system. Their politics were good on this front, right? But the reason so many of them found the need to ask this non-question question was because their politics were all bungled up. What they were doing was falling for the idea that the only people deserving a cheerleader are those who don't mess up, who live flawlessly or even angelically. The deserving immigrant myth, right? The perfect angel immigrant myth. A 17-year-old boy far from home who had survived horrific things to get here with limited family support. You want my cheerleading? Don't mess up, walk the straight line, earn it, and a single misstep, it might be taken away. I share these stories as instances that the border infecting those of us who know ourselves to be working to counteract it, right? It's an insidious line, though, and we have to be careful. Where I wonder all the time, and I ask us to wonder, do borders infect us or a default thinking, our institutions, our centers of learning? Where do we allow ourselves to default to the norm of violent exclusion in rhetoric or deed? And how do we exercise those from our classrooms, from our community centers, from our staff meetings, right? From our strategic planning sessions? Our work is really hard, and it's full of hard questions, and it can also be full of heartbreak as well as joy. But to be true agents of belonging, we have to do this excavation and see what mythologies we might be metabolizing and perpetuating, even as we work tirelessly toward welcoming our new students from Afghanistan, from the Ukraine, from all over the world. Thank you for being agents of belonging, for working to build systems in service of welcome and to disrupt systems built to exclude. This work is justice work, it's public health work, it's community work, it's global work, and it's futurist work. This is meaningful work with immediate purpose and work that reverberates all around the world, well beyond the walls of our institutions of learning, our communities. So thank you, and onward.